first reading uses very radical and very harsh language, especially in that second paragraph when it says, "Put to death, then, the parts of you that are earthly, immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, greed." Put that to death. St. Paul uses a lot of times very dramatic language, very dramatic words, but to underscore a point, a radical response. Put to death those things that make you sin. Because the sin and the things that make us sin lead us to death. And so if we put to death that's the radical response in life when we recognize what our sin is. It's the only response for St. Paul, a radical response. Maybe we'll say it's exaggerated, but nevertheless, it has to be a radical response. I think we're not that foreign to radical responses, because 18 years ago, around this time, there was a radical response underway to a new situation in the world, a way that living and maybe things that we would have never thought happened. Who would have ever thought that New York City would be attacked? Who would have ever thought that the Twin Towers that graced the skyline, something so it would be brought down in one day by just a couple of men? Who would have thought all the destruction that happened in one day in this side of the world? This side of the world hasn't seen an attack since 1812. And yet, we lived through that. We were here for that. And what was the response afterwards? We live in a new culture that, well, maybe most of us have already experienced. We can't travel the way we used to travel before September 11th, 18 years ago. There was a radical response to that. And there seems to be no way around that. Traveling was different. New wars erupted and are still going on around the world, starting from that day, September 11th. And we live now in a culture, I would say it's a culture of suspicion. It's a culture of constant suspicion about what might happen, who could do something that, well, we can't escape it. We're part of it. And so our world changed. There was a radical, maybe we might say even exaggerated response to what happened 18 years ago. But you see, sin has the same effect on us. Because even if we don't commit a particular sin, the fact that someone else commits it has an effect on all of us. It has an effect on our relationship with God, but it also affects us. And just like none of us are terrorists in here, in a certain way we have to pay the price of terrorism. We enter an airport, we're already under suspicion. We look at others under suspicion. We submit ourselves to that suspicion. And so things are not the same after. In the history of sin, when that first sin enters in kind of what we call original sin, reminds us that things are not the same when sin enters the picture. It mars it strains our relationship with God, but it also changes the world around us. Because something that God had willed, well, man got in the way and messed it up. How do we fix that? How do we set things back again? Well, especially when things can't be the same. Well, that's where the grace of reconciliation comes in. And grace of reconciliation allows us to continue towards God despite that history and despite the consequences of what was done. The same way we move ahead and we continue in our lives, and as a country we move ahead despite that history, despite the memory, and despite the consequences of what happened 18 years ago. There's a reconciliation of sorts that goes underway when we can still continue and move on and progress despite that. And in a certain way, that's what we ask God when He reconciles us, when we ask Him for that reconciliation, that forgiveness of our sins, to forgive exactly that and help us move and continue towards Him, despite that things are not the same. and we'll continue to remember how they're not the same. And so we ask the Lord on this day to continually renew in our minds also that moment of reconciliation, because I always say it's part of the history. When we think of our sin, we have to think also and remember the day that we were reconciled. That becomes part of that history, because the sin cannot overshadow the reconciliation and forgiveness. It's the other way around. Sin stays in the shadow of that forgiveness. And so we ask the Lord today for our country, for ourselves, and also for that perseverance to move ahead towards the Lord, to move ahead despite that history of sin that we have, despite those memories of sins that have been already reconciled and forgiven. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.